As part of John's Misspent Youth Tour, we thought we might ask an authority on the family history to give us a little background so that we would have that a recorded oral history of John's background and John's heritage. And so his father has graciously offered to do that.
Okay, the story begins on April 2nd of 1840. And we're over in County Clare, Ireland, which is on the west coast of Ireland, not far from where the Spanish Armada ran into a little bit of trouble with the British. But on April 2nd of 1840, Andrew White married the girl next door in the farm, and her name was Mary Cory, C-O-R-Y. Andrew's name, of course, was White, W-H-I-T-E, and we'll come back to that later in the story. They were married in Mullagh, M-U-L-L-A-G-H, in County Clare, Ireland. Since Mary's family was Roman Catholic, they were married in the Catholic parish. Andrew's family was Protestant, but she was the girl next door. In July of 1841, their first child was born. It was a girl, and they named her after her mother, Mary White. On May 4th of 1843, they had a son, and they named him James. So he was born near Milltown, Malby, which is an old mill town, just a few kilometers from the family where the family was living. He was actually born in a house that very much was like the images you have of old Ireland, not the sod hut, but a very small, long and narrow little house. Today, that's a bed and breakfast operated by John and Mare Daly in County Clare, Ireland. John has actually visited, and Kay with him, to see the Dalys. In July of 1845, there was another girl born, and her name was Catherine. Now, it's pure speculation, but there is in the family some lore that at some point, when the potato famine came perhaps, which began about 1845 and ran for several years, the story is that Andrew left the family, came to America to seek his fortune, found his way to Hillsdale, Michigan, and had the plan to come back to get his family. But this is something I cannot prove. The story is that somehow he was actually killed between the ship and the dock. But whether that happened in America or whether it happened in Ireland, I don't have any idea. I've done a very modest attempt to look at newspaper clippings in the library in Dublin, only to find nothing is said about anybody being killed, between a ship and a dock. But Mary, or we now will start calling her Big Mama, decided to follow through on the family plan. My guess is she probably said, I can handle the two girls, but what am I going to do with the boy? And so she actually left James behind with an uncle, whether it was Andrew's brother or her own brother, because both of them had brothers, that I don't know. But she took the two girls and went on her way and found her way to Hillsdale, Michigan. Later, looking at veteran records in the National Archives in Washington, there's an affidavit in which James says, after my uncle died, a friend of the family took me to my own family in America. So he was able to join up with them. Now he becomes the focal point of pretty much the rest of the story, because in 1861, in the spring, after Confederate cannon began to shoot at Fort Sumter, Abraham Lincoln called for 50,000 men to volunteer that first week of the war to join the Union Army. James ran away from home. My guess is he jumped on a train, got himself to Cleveland, Ohio, and he enlisted in the 7th Ohio Volunteers. He was underage. They only took men age 18 and older, so he must have lied about his age, but he was only a month or two short, because this was April. His birthday was in May. He was actually born on May 4th of 1843.
You know, I always stretch the truth about that with my social studies class of 5th graders. I sort of take other stories I had heard and attribute them to my great-grandfather, saying that what he did was wrote the number 18 on a piece of paper and stuck it inside his shoe so that when the recruitment officer asked him his age, he could say, "I am over 18," without lying. So
Well,
I stretch the truth and attribute that to him.
that's a little bit of a stretch. But anyway, the story goes on. And his first enlistment was only for 3 months. So if he enlisted in April, it would have been May, June, July. He would have been out, except that there was pretty heavy pressure by that time for people to re-enlist, which he did, and he re-enlisted for a 3-year period. So now he finds himself part of the 7th Ohio Volunteers. They pretty much spent the early part of the war in the area now known as West Virginia. Statehood hadn't yet come to West Virginia, but so they were involved in some skirmishes in West Virginia, one of which the record, an area called Cross Keys, and it's confusing because there are actually two little communities in West Virginia called Cross Keys. This one, I think, is sort of southern West Virginia. One of them is up near Charleston. I think the one in the south, where it says the 7th Ohio Volunteers were routed. So they were kind of embarrassed by their initial contact with Confederate soldiers. And then they were moved around that area, and finally by the winter of, this would have been 1862 now.
Well, pause for a moment.
So during the early part of the winter of 1862, the 7th Ohio took part in what was known as the Mud March, where the Union soldiers, literally, they were going to make an attack essentially against Fredericksburg, Virginia, but were not able to do it because they got bogged down in the mud. And some of the witnesses talk about seeing mules dying in the mud as if it were quicksand, and it was just a debacle, just an absolute ridiculous thing. So they wind up back in Virginia. I'm trying to remember the name of the town where they spent the rest of the winter then. Why, I don't believe his unit was directly involved in the Battle of Fredericksburg, which was, of course, that horrible thing where the Confederates were up on the mountain, or I mean on the hillside, and shooting down, and the Union, again, it was a terrible, disgraceful kind of enterprise. Anyway, he winds up at Chancellorsville, which would have been early May of 1863. He had missed out on the Battle of Antietam. He may have had an illness or something like that. But he was at Chancellorsville, and that's the famous battle where Stonewall Jackson was shot by his own men at the end of the first day of battle. But Stonewall Jackson's maneuver won the day for the Confederates. Union Army should have won the battle. There was absolutely no question about it. And this is one of the battles where one could say they pulled defeat out of the jaws of victory. They had weak units, untrained and unreliable on their right flank, and Stonewall Jackson's men were able, 20,000 of them, to come around, hit them from the side, and the Unions just fell into a retreat. The 7th Ohio apparently was, if not the last, one of the last units holding the field underneath cannon fire from Confederates, again on a high point, and they were covering the retreat of the Union Army. James White was badly wounded. He had 2 wounds that were described again in his veterans papers and National Archives. One, he had very severe burns across his back, and if you realize that with all the cannon fire going on, the woods were set afire, and there are any number of ways in which he could have received those burns. Probably before he received the burns, he must have been hit in the head by a rifle butt, and for the rest of his life there was a very severe dent in his head. So then the story goes that he, along with all the other wounded coming out of Chancellorsville, were taken down to the rivers, the Potomac River in particular, and floated by barge to Washington. So he was in the first of 4 hospitals staying in Washington. And that was just where Walt Whitman, for example, was serving as a nurse in the Washington area. And he described the early casualties coming in by barge. He said, if these are the more lightly wounded, I'd hate to see the rest. It was apparently a rather, unhappy sight. After some time in Washington, he was then moved to Philadelphia to a hospital. And in talking with the director of the Civil War Medical Museum in Frederick, Maryland, some years ago, I couldn't understand why they moved him to 4 different hospitals. But he asked what was the nature of the wound. I told him about this head wound. He said that Philadelphia was the only hospital of the Union where they specialized in head wounds. And that hospital in Philadelphia was Market Square in Philadelphia, about a half mile from where we lived for 30 years. Then he was next moved to a hospital in Cleveland. And again, I asked the director of the Medical Museum in Frederick, why Cleveland? He said, well, where was he from? And I said, well, Hillsdale, Michigan, and then I remembered he had enlisted in Cleveland. So as far as the Army records were concerned, he was an Ohioan and was from Cleveland. So they attempted to move the wounded as close to home as they could as soon as they were able to travel. Then the question was, why did they move him to a 4th hospital, which was Cincinnati? And the answer was, that was a restaging area for troops who would then get well enough to be reassigned to the Western Front, where Grant had been, and with Vicksburg and all of that activity going on. So he was destined to be moved to the Western Front, except that his wounds were such that he was able to become ambulatory, and they turned him into an orderly, which was very common, so that the wounded were helping take care of other wounded. It's at that time that he met a Miss Harriet Elizabeth Harrison, and Harrison is spelled with 2 R's and 2 S's, Harrisson. So he married Harriet Harrison, who was one of his nurses. That was January in Cincinnati of January of 1864. 11 months later, November 19th of 1864, my grandfather was born, and he was named Andrew John White, presumably named for his grandfather, Andrew White. And that was 1864. Elizabeth and James actually had 9 children. Only 7 of which lived into adulthood, as far as I know. And maybe for the record, I'll just name them. Of course, Andrew was born in 1864. And then in 1866, August 29th, Jenny White Allen was born. And your brother Jamie, in essence, was named after one of her sons, Jamie Allen. And of course, indirectly, I suppose, for my great grandfather, James White. Then in 1868, June 17th, Mary White Slater was born. And then in July 19th of 1870, Harriet J. White was born. And I believe Harriet is the one. She never married. And as far as I know, she spent most of her adult life in a mental hospital. And I don't know too much more, really about her. In October of 13th of 1872, Gerard Horace White was born. I don't really know any more about him. And then in October 13th of 1874, Honora White Miller was born. Let me just pause a second to come back to the rest of the children, but 1874 was quite a momentous year. This was the year in which Rutherford B. Hayes was elected President of the United States on the Republican ticket. By this time, James White was a policeman in Cincinnati and also was probably a committeeman for the Democratic Party. And like all committeemen, he was helping people get out to vote. And sometimes to encourage them to vote, a couple of dollars may have passed hands. And so he was charged, after the election, he was charged with election fraud in the federal court. The Cincinnati Enquirer, which was always heavily weighted, and still is, as far as I know, toward the Republican Party, took on his cause. And they covered the 3-day trial in great detail. And their basic argument was Jim White was just being put up as a fall guy, that he was not doing anything that every politician in Cincinnati had been doing. And why should they pick on him? So they really took him on. Well, he was convicted, and he was sentenced to prison as a federal prisoner, but there was no federal prison anywhere around there, so they put him in the Ohio Penitentiary, which is a state institution. Now the story kind of gets interesting, because by this time my grandfather, who had been born in 1864, he's now 10 years old, almost 11. And with the father in prison, there's no way to support the family. And you see how many children they have already, 6 children. And my grandfather's the oldest of them at almost 11. And so every Friday he was to go to the home of the publisher of the Cincinnati Enquirer, and this staunch Republican gave him an envelope with enough money for his mother to feed the family. And this went on for 6 months. And my guess is that the publisher and his newspaper put an awful lot of pressure on Ohio Republicans, and one of those was Rutherford B. Hayes. And so after 6 months he pardoned James, and he was able to return home. He could never be a policeman again. So he became something of a private detective, working kind of on his own and all. The story is he probably also owned a bar at some place, sometime in Cincinnati. But anyway, in 1876, October 3rd, Margaret White Moak was born. So now we have a total of 7 children. And as far as I know, then Elizabeth White Crane was born February 19th, 1881, and James D. White, interestingly enough, was born December 26th of 1884. I know that James D. did not live into adulthood. I don't know which of the girls did not, but definitely James did not, because my grandfather was the only boy among this brood of 7 kids. So, life goes on, and James was something of a survivor, and he lived until 1928. And my mother actually, met him. My mother and father were married in 1927. So, I have heard some descriptions from her of him. He was, pretty tired old man with a hole in the head in 1928, and I don't know quite what caused his death, but and I don't know anything about Harriet's death, but they're all buried in and around Cincinnati. So that's kind of the story of the White clan. My grandfather then went on to work in for a couple of different railroads and for the interurban system. And he himself was very proud that at some point he was licensed to carry a gun and was sort of a detective for the railroads, but he was basically doing office kind of work. And at some point, the family moved out of Cincinnati and moved to East St. Louis, Illinois. So my father was born in East St. Louis, Illinois, before they then moved back to Cincinnati. And he finished much of his high school in Cincinnati, except then they moved to Columbus, Ohio, and my father graduated from East High School in Columbus, Ohio. And then he went on to Ohio State and graduated from Ohio State Law School in 1927, and he was the editor of the Law Review and the first in his class of the law school of that. And then just to kind of follow through on that, so he needs a job. So he's a graduate of law school. By the way, in college he had done an accounting major. So my father was a CPA as well as an attorney, which in his time was unheard of, but probably one of the smartest combinations that you can ever imagine for the time. And so he needed a job, and he found himself as first in his class being interviewed by a couple of guys who were lawyers. One was William E. Knepper, and the other one was Peter Dempsey. One was an Episcopalian, one was a Roman Catholic. At that time, my father was a Baptist. And so he thought they were offering him a job. What he realized when he got to work on his first day was they had brought him in as a full partner. So the firm became known as Knepper, White, and Dempsey. And so the first day of work, he was a full partner in a little law firm that had, two old men. Within a couple of years, young Bill Knepper graduated from Ohio State. And of course, the plan of William E. Knepper all along was, we'll have him there too. But they didn't change the name of the law firm. It still was Knepper, White, and Dempsey. At some point, there were a couple of others. By the time my father died, it was probably the largest law firm in Columbus. And they had 25 or 30 lawyers, which for Columbus at that time was my father died in 1970, so that was a pretty big law firm. Within about 5 years, the law firm merged with a firm in Cleveland, the name of which I never can remember. And so the firm still goes on, but not Knepper, White, and Dempsey anymore. The name comes out of the Cleveland firm with a rather large Columbus office. So that's kind of the story of the Whites that brings us down to me. and there we are.
Okay. One question, going back, you this time you left out Andrew's conversion.
Oh,
to
okay, yeah, let's go back. I told
being
you.
a Baptist.
I think I did say on the film that every Friday, as
Yes.
a 10, 11-year-old,
Yes.
he went up to this big house owned by the publisher, the Enquirer, to get this money. Well, when he met my grandmother, and here the story is, he had had a marriage about which I know very little. Somewhere, I know that the name is probably in somewhere in some records. I know my mother knew very well what the name was and all, and my father too. And that woman is buried also in the Cincinnati area. But that marriage did not last for some reason. There must have been a divorce. And then my grandfather met Anna Margaret von Ida. And there's a little bit of a story there. That was my grandmother then, Anna Margaret von Ida. And the von, of course, in Germany would be a kind of a symbol of nobility. The word means of, so it's of a village or of a town or of a castle or whatever. And the story is that the von Idas were kind of pushed out of Germany because they were not of noble stock. They were a peasant family, but they insisted on keeping the von in their name. And so anyway, I don't know much more, although her father, I know, did serve in the Civil War, and I think he was an officer. I have tried in vain to find some of his records down at the National Archives, and I've not yet found really anything about it. But there's probably a story there to be told too. So anyway, my grandmother was a pious little lady, and so was a Baptist, and she insisted that my grandfather, remember, whose mother and grandmother had been Roman Catholic, so he had been baptized and confirmed in the Roman Catholic Church. But my grandmother insisted that he take her to a Bible study of a group of Baptists up in a house in Cincinnati, which turned out to be that big house on the hill where he had gone every Friday for 6 months to get the money for his family to live on. And naturally, he had a conversion experience. Whether it happened exactly that night or shortly thereafter, I'm not sure, but it surely did happen, and he became a staunch Baptist. My father became a Lutheran and was confirmed a Lutheran 1 week before I was confirmed. When Paul Ansbach, who was our pastor at the time, finally said to my mother, "Your membership is still up in Middle Point, Ohio. You have a daughter and you have a son who are confirmed and are members here of First English in Columbus. It's about time you transfer your membership. You know, you've been a member in Middle Point, you know, all your life, married in 1927. Now you've got a son, and it's 1945, and he's about to be confirmed. It's about time you transfer your membership." And he looked at my father and said, "And it's about time you join your family." So he said, "All right." And the next Sunday he was taking up the offering. When he died, of course, he was treasurer of the Synod of Ohio, and his CPA training came back in to help with some of that. So it was full cycle.
Yeah. The other thing was back to James. The wounds were burns and the rifle butt to the head, but I thought there was a knife or bayonet wound. No, there's some scar.
I've not found any record of that.
Okay, I thought there was some.
It's bad enough to have a hole in your head.
Yeah.
My guess, you know, it's pure guess. I'm guessing that somehow he was hit with a rifle toward the end of the skirmishing as they were defending the thing, and was carried off the battlefield, but probably through woods that were burning. And in some way, something happened. An ember, a bough of a tree hit him, you know, burning thing. Somebody dropped him, who knows? But something like that happened, that probably the burns were then the second event after the first. I can't imagine it happening the other way around.
Also, wasn't there a mix-up about the spelling of the name, and also the fact he didn't get paid
I've
for
said
that?
I'd come back to that.
Yeah.
Well, when he ran away from home in Hillsdale, got himself to Cleveland, my source here is an affidavit that he made as he later was applying for veteran benefits. And anybody doing family history, if you go into military records, often the most revealing information is found when you look up when these guys were applying for some kind of veterans bonus, because they have to give kind of the whole history of their service and who they were and all this kind of stuff. So in this thing, he describes how angry he was when the officer who swore him in misspelled his name and spelled White with a Y. We have his discharge paper, as you two know, and it's in Jamie's possession, and it says James White, W-H-Y-T-E, born in Ireland. That's all it says. And then the officer who's discharging him is signing this. Well, back in Cleveland, when he is enlisting, the guy writes White with a Y. When we were in Ireland in 2001, we found the parish priest in this County Clare area, Father Toohey, and I said something to Father Toohey about how angry James was when he found his name had been misspelled. In his affidavit he said, "And for 3 years and 3 months to get paid, I had to write my name with a Y. And you can just kind of feel the anger coming there. To which Father Toohey said, well, of course he was angry. He said, here in County Clare, if your name is spelled with a Y, sure, you're a Catholic. But if your name is spelled with an I, you're a Protestant. Of course he was angry. Thank you. I'd forgotten about that.
All right, let's do a pause here.
And tell us a little bit about your mother so John will have that info too.
Okay, well, now we start in either 1748 or perhaps 1749. I'm not 100% sure. I'm going to say 1748, when Wilhelm Georg Forster was born in Prussia. But I have to tell you, the Prussia that you read about in history, changed its boundaries several times. And so by this time, the great Frederick the Great of Prussia had conquered all of Saxony. So the truth of the matter is that the Forster family were Saxons.
Okay.
And they lived probably near the city today of Halle, Halle. So, of course, they were Prussian legally because they had been conquered by the Prussians. And that, you'd have to go into European history, and I may get a little bit into the story, but it's a fascinating period of time. And I think finally that reality that the Prussians had conquered Saxony might very well have been the reason why Wilhelm Georg Forster and his brother George left Saxony, Prussia, went through England, and George stayed in England, and that's all I know of him, and Wilhelm came on alone to America, and that would have been in 1764. So here's a 16-year-old boy. Why would a 16-year-old boy leave Prussia to come to America? This is a family that was influenced by the Lutheran pietism of the time, and very likely the prospect of him being mustered into the Prussian army, which was going to be a certainty for anyone who was a male of that age, probably not a very desirable product from the family point of view.
Mm-hmm.
So my guess is that's the motivating factor that gets him to leave with a brother. And it was not unusual at all for Germans to go to England, stay for literally a few weeks or months waiting for a ship, and study English while they were there. And they would learn enough to get by.
Mm-hmm.
So he comes to America. I've never really yet been able to identify which port he came in or anything, but obviously came by ship. So he's here in 1864 as a 16-year-old, and he must have been living in Berks County, Pennsylvania. There may have been other family, other friends, what have you there. Somewhere along the line, and I should have refreshed my memory on what year it was, but anyway, in Berks County, he meets and marries Maria Magdalena Daniels, and they set up housekeeping in Northumberland County. And this is a period of time when there were only 4 counties in all of Pennsylvania. So Northumberland County was literally more than 1/4 of the state. Just a huge area. I have found in Sunbury, Pennsylvania, in the courthouse, records of deeds of land that they bought in what's called the Buffalo Valley. We know that, well, first of all, let me just say, they had 12 children.
Oh.
And we know that one of those was my, if they, the 2 of them, were my great-great-great grandparents, then we know that Georg Forster was my great-great-grandfather, and we know that he was born in September of 1789 in Northumberland County, in Mahanoy Township, and that pretty much pinpoints the area just north of Sunbury. The present Northumberland County is relatively small. It could have been that county or a neighboring county, but it's, we could pinpoint that, and I've talked with some people who tell me the Buffalo Valley would be pretty easy to locate. I haven't done too much there. Now, at some point of time between the birth of Georg, who must have been child number, 6 or 7, I can't remember exactly. But anyway, sometime they moved from there into the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. And again, this was pretty common. There had been, I don't know why they moved, but there had been a number of very late Indian raids in and around this area of Pennsylvania, and that caused a large number of Germans to look for a little safer kind of place to live. There's one historical account I read that says they counted over 300 wagons of Germans leaving this area and going south into the Shenandoah Valley. Now, I say between 1789 and 1798, sometime in there, they bought land. And I've also found in Woodstock, Virginia, in the courthouse, record of land being bought by them in that area in and around Woodstock. And obviously, I also saw evidence of them selling land in Pennsylvania, again in the Sunbury. So, there's all of this. But why do I pick on 1798? By this time, if he was born in 1748, which I think is most likely, that means in 98 he was 50 years old. And suddenly there comes a request from 3 small Lutheran congregations in the Shenandoah Valley, in an area, part of it probably in what is now West Virginia, that panhandle that kind of hangs over Washington. One of these congregations or 2 in Virginia, and these congregations are sending a petition to the Ministerium of Pennsylvania and adjacent states, the First Lutheran Synod, and they're requesting that they name this pious old German farmer to be their pastor. He's 50 years old. Well, in those days, somehow the ministerium voted to do that. And so they licensed him to preach, which was common. So for 4 years, he was a licensed preacher of the Ministerium of Pennsylvania. And then in 1802, at the Synod Convention in Reading, Pennsylvania, he was ordained. And again, this was common. The period of licensure was, first of all, they have a good reputation. They have shown they know some theology, and over a period of time, they must demonstrate they know more. Usually what happens is they begin to read under the guidance of another pastor. Mm-hmm. So, now at age 54, he's ordained. Almost immediately, he is sent by the ministerium as a traveling missionary to Ohio. Well, first of all, the source of information here would be minutes of the Ministerium of Pennsylvania. And for a few years, he begins to report so many baptisms, so many confirmations, so many funerals, so many services held, and all these things are left. But he sent on this missionary journal, and in the Philadelphia Seminary Library, the archives, there are actually 2 journals in his handwriting where he keeps records of accounting so that when he can make reports back to the ministerium of what he has accomplished. So there were other people, particularly a guy by the name of Hinkle and others in and around the Pittsburgh area, who made brief trips into Ohio. But the ministerium, and I forget what year it is now exactly, but the ministerium, after this one jaunt over there, they appoint him to be a permanent missionary to Ohio. And at the same time, they appoint another fellow to be a permanent missionary to Tennessee. So his responsibility is basically the whole state of Ohio. And that comes into the story a little bit later. So he goes over and he settles in I guess it's Perry County, Ohio, which is just south and east of Columbus. And incidentally, he again begins to sell the land he had now in Virginia, as he had sold the land in Pennsylvania, and he begins to buy land in Ohio. And the land he buys was in the refugee tract. I have yet to find very many people who know what I'm even talking about. But when the Northwest Territory was formed in 1802, there were set aside in Ohio certain tracts of lands. One was the Western Reserve for Connecticut. Another a couple of them were for military purposes, and a number of reserved land. There was 100,000 acres that stretched from the Scioto River in Columbus to the Muskingum River in New Concord, Ohio, a very narrow band of 100,000 acres of land. And this was available to refugees from Canada who had sided with the revolution in America in the 1770s, 80s, and therefore were unwelcome to go back to Canada. So all they had to do was have some testimony, some evidence of who they were and what their sentiments were, and they could have free land in Ohio. But they only had a limited period of years to do that. And so by the time Forster arrives, about 1804, that period of time has expired. So now they have set up land offices and people begin to buy land. I have seen about 5 different deeds from which he bought land, the first of which is the most interesting of all. It's a parchment paper, pre-printed with hand-inked in information, which says, I, Thomas Jefferson, President of these United States, hereby deed to Wilhelm Gehord Forster, and it describes 160 acres of land, and there's the signature, T.H. Jefferson. Countersigned by James A. Madison, Secretary of State. There's a second one, not a parchment, now in more common paper. I, James Madison, President of these United States, hereby deed to, and so forth. And thereafter, the deeds are signed by land commissioners. Actually, the presidents of the United States, for an extended period of time, actually signed all of these deeds for land in that whole area, until finally, in Ohio, they set up these land offices about 1805, 6, somewhere in that period of time. So he gets over there, he begins to establish congregations, he begins to gather Lutherans together. The Ministerium of Pennsylvania minutes will show him present in a given year, not present another year. You have to remember, it had to come over the mountains. The meetings were either in Philadelphia or Reading or Hagerstown. And, they moved around because it was the Ministerium of Pennsylvania and adjacent states, which meant kind of Maryland and Virginia. And so he was there part of the time. And then it gets kind of interesting because at one point, about 1811, he's the only one from his whole territory who comes to the meeting, and he dutifully brings along a written complaint from some of the lay people in the congregation against him. And he presents this. And the ministerium doesn't know quite what to do with that. What they do is they always establish little committees of 3 pastors who will examine these complaints. One of the complaints I recall, the most interesting, was he preaches too much from the apocalypse. So he must have been a fire and brimstone kind of preacher. And so the committee meets, and basically the committee says, we have no witnesses, we don't know, we can't deal with this. So the whole matter is referred to a special conference which is to be called in Ohio, and they're to deal with the matter. Now by this time, Forster has some counter charges, not against the people of the parish, but against a guy who he says has invaded his territory and is trying to take over the congregation. His name is Leicester. And so he issues this complaint. So anyway, the conference deals with all this, and the judgment is made that that Leicester better stay and Forster better let him stay, and forget it. So he probably wasn't very happy about that. At this special conference, he is asked the question, first of all, he is saying that nobody else should come in to take over congregations away from his thing. They're all his. And when asked, Mr. Forster, what do you consider to be your assigned territory? It says he stood, at his full height and said with conviction, the Northwest Territory. That would be Michigan, Wisconsin, Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio. But actually his charge was really from New Madrid, which was Columbus, to Lake Erie. So it was a little bit smaller than the Northwest Territory. But essentially, he was operating in and around Perry County, which is essentially Lancaster. Now, I said they had 12 children, and I don't know too much about any of those, except that the youngest of all was named Christian. And when the War of 1812 came up, there was, I think, there must have been a draft or something like that. And Gayhorg, my great-great-grandfather, is called upon to serve in the army in the War of 1812. But by this time, Gayhorg or George is married, has children, I don't know how many, and Christian, who is unmarried and quite young, steps forward and says, I will take my brother's place. So Christian serves the duty that should have been fallen to George. And he serves up in Lake Erie area. He may or may not have been on what they called a privateer, a ship on the Lake Erie, because there were a number of battles, in Lake Erie itself in the War of 1812. His enlistment is actually only for 6 months, and part of the time he's actually ill, and when he is discharged, he walks 120 miles back home. And the veterans' records again show that he was reimbursed for his mileage for walking home. Except that to get some veterans benefits, they said, you never served in the Army. George served in the Army. So the kind thing that he did got all messed up in the records. So in his records in the National Archives, there are a number of affidavits of fellow soldiers who said, I was with him, in Sandusky County, and another fellow who said, I was actually his nurse when he was ill. And so he did get his veteran benefits. He then moved back and settled in Sandusky County, and so he finished his life up by Lake Erie. He kind of liked it up there. So that's essentially what I know about him. But now let's go back, because that's Wilhelm, and then Wilhelm's son was Gayhorg, and then Gayhorg's son was Simon, and by the time Wilhelm Forster dies, on his tombstone it reads William Foster. So the German has now been anglicized by the time of his death. So it's Foster from then on. So now let's go back again, Wilhelm Forster, and then George Foster, and then Simon Foster, and then my grandmother, she has a very unusual name. I don't have it here. It'll come to me. And then my mother, and then me. So from 1748 to my birth in 1932, you've got Wilhelm, Georg, Simon, my grandmother, my mother. That's not very many generations. So anyway, so here you go. My mother was the youngest of 8 children, only 7 of whom lived. Her oldest sister died when she was 16, so my mother hadn't even been born yet, because the next oldest was 19 years older than my mother. So anyway, now, okay, but now we come back to Wilhelm, who married Maria Magdalena Daniels. The Daniels family was pretty significant. It was a French family. And we can trace that French family back to the year 1420. And the reason we can do that, there's a volume in the state library in Pennsylvania that is essentially the family's biographies of Pennsylvania, and it lists all these generations going back to 1420, because my grandmother, Almenary was her name, Almenary
okay.
Foster, but Maria Magdalena was the first female in her line all the way back to 1420. You know, had there been other girls, you know, the whole thing would have been lost. But the fact that the name remains Daniels through a male, Daniels, Maria Magdalena, you know, this you can trace this thing. And there are a couple of interesting little anecdotes. They were from Devray, which is up near the English Channel, and obviously it was some kind of lesser nobility, because it was kind of a noble family. We know that one son was disinherited by his father because he had come under the influence of those Lutherans, which means he had become a French Huguenot. He had become a Protestant. So the father, and a lot of the Huguenots in France were, you know, at one point the Huguenots were very influential in France, but gradually the Roman Catholic noble families kind of pushed them out, and so many of these Huguenots moved to Germany and other places. There were even Huguenot cemetery in Dublin, Ireland, where the Huguenots were kind of forced out of France. So the family, the Daniels family, at a relatively early point becomes Protestant in the early 1600s, and becomes quite German, really, even though the Daniels name is a French name. And so Adam Daniels, who was Maria Magdalena's father, is the one who comes to America, and she's born there. And interestingly enough, the patriarch of Lutheranism in America is Henry Melchior Muhlenberg, and he married the daughter of Conrad Weiser, who was an Indian scout and a very, very influential colonial leader here in Pennsylvania. And interestingly enough, the marriage records of Wilhelm Forster and Maria Magdalena Daniel is in the same book, same congregation, few years difference, of course, between the marriage of Henry Melchior Muhlenberg and his wife, the daughter of Conrad Weiser. So that, you know, it's northern Berks County. So there you have that. So you ask about my mother. Now, if you really go back, there was a point at which one of these sons of the Daniels family married the daughter of Jacques Humbert, who was apparently a very famous French guy whose ancestry could be traced back to the Marcomers. There were 4 Marcomers, Marcomer 1, Marcomer 2, 3, and 4. And they were nobles, essentially, who one of them became the first king of France. I think of Marcomer IV as really the first person who had the title of king of France. And so, you know, you can trace that Humbert back to Marcomer, and we're really pretty early at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And Marcomer's family can be traced back through the ages to the city of Troy.
Oh, wow.
And now we're talking about 400 BC. But the problem is I'm absolutely convinced and sure of the date 1420. The rest is internet stuff that could be garbage in, garbage out.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
But if you do the tracing,
Mm-hmm.
you know, using Jacques Humbert and all this kind of thing, you get yourself back to Troy. It's
Mm.
kind of fun to go to Troy, which I did,
Uh-huh.
and stand there and say, well, I'm home again.
Looks familiar.
Of course, you know, after 800, we're all related anyway.
Mm.
Everybody's related to Charlemagne. That's true.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah, if you trace every family there, somehow you get back to Charlemagne about 800.
Hmm.
So there weren't very many families really as you go back in there. So, you know, if the data are preserved, it's pretty easy
Mm-hmm.
to discover some of this stuff. But it's very highly questionable, you know, how.
And how did your mother and father meet?
Well, that's a good question. I believe, well, first of all, I said that my mother was one of 8
Uh-huh.
children, and there were 2 boys and essentially 5 girls that lived. The oldest died when she was 16. The oldest girl, and the oldest of the whole family, was my Aunt Laura. And Laura married Claude Fast, and you have met Susan Brooks,
Mm-hmm.
so she comes out of that line. And so Aunt Laura, Fast also was involved either with, and here I'm not totally sure, either with the interurbans. You remember we're talking about the early, you know, the teens and 1920s and that period of time. And the interurbans in Ohio and around were crisscrossing the state. These were like trolley cars, high-speed trolley cars. And my grandfather was working for this, and Uncle Claude was working for, you know, and living up by that time in Canton, Ohio. They lived a number of places. And somehow Claude and Laura said to my grandfather, your son ought to meet Laura's sister. And by golly, they arranged it and they did. My mother had graduated from high school, and she was running a candy store in Delphos, Ohio. Delphos, Ohio. So she was a little independent businesswoman at that point in time.
Mm-hmm.
And here comes this guy who's, you know, in law school, and he was pretty thin and skinny, and she fattened him up a little bit. And somehow that's how they met. And that's about all I know about that. But it was through my aunt and uncle. And again, my aunt was 19 years older than my mother. Just an anecdote, I do remember Ohio did not have required driver's licenses until about, I'm going to say, 1935, 1936.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, you got a car, you just drive it. But the word came out that the legislature is going to require everybody to get a driver's license. And to get a driver's license, you're going to have to take a test. Scared my mother to death. So she quickly was able to do it before the test was required. So she got her driver's license. And the first thing she did was take the car all alone and drive from Columbus to Canton to visit Aunt Laura.
Ah.
And, you know, we heard about that for years as a kid, you know, how brave she was to drive all I remember about Canton in the 1930s is all they had were brick streets. Every street was made out of brick. That's all I remember about that. But, you know, how brave she was to drive from Columbus all the way to Canton. And if you figure what the cars were like.
And what the roads, especially outside the city.
Yeah.
was like?
Well, they were not that bad, but they weren't totally good. And of course, you always expect a flat tire.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, even when I was a kid, it was unusual to make a trip without a flat tire.
Well, thank you very, very much.
Well, there you are. My golly, we got more in there than we thought, didn't we?
That's good.
Okay.
Well, as an afterthought, Kay was asking me about kind of where the Revolutionary War period fit
Right.
in, and I'd forgotten to say that Wilhelm Forster. Remember, he's here in 1764,
Right.
and the French and Indian War is kind of raging, which in Europe is the 7 Years' War, and that's another whole story. Which is kind of fun to pick because that was a world war. The French and Indian War was no small potato stuff. This is how England gets India, and all this kind of stuff is going on. I mean, we're talking about a world war, but here it's the French and Indian War, and so he's involved in this, and by the time the mid 1770s comes, 1776 and the like, there is a problem on the western frontier of the colonies, and that would be Pennsylvania. And the problem is the Indians, still now the British are trying to recruit on their side for the Revolution. So what happened was militias were formed in the various counties and states, and Northumberland County, Pennsylvania, was one of the most famous of the militia groups. For the most part, as far as I know, the Northumberland militia basically was told, you stay home, you are protecting the western frontier. So you're killing two birds with one stone. You're protecting your home and family, and you're protecting all of the colonies from an attack that would come from the rear. But the Northumberland militia also had elements of it. They found their way in many, many battles. They were up in New England, not at Lexington and Concord particularly, but in battles right after that. They were on Long Island, and they were among those who saw that forest of ships bringing the British, the sail, what do I want to call it, the masts the sails were on, looked like a forest to them. And then they fought in New Jersey. They fought in the Battle of Germantown. They fought all over the place. When Washington retreats to Valley Forge, and you see images of ragtag soldiers with no shoes, that's the Northumberland militia.
Okay.
Now my hunch is that Forster did not serve far away from home. He might have, but I don't think so. I think he was one of those who were protecting the western frontier. But I have seen in the records in the state library in Harrisburg, I've seen 2 certificates of, again, benefits paid to him from various points of time for his service in the Northumberland militia. So there's documented records of his service in that revolution. So even though he might not have wanted to serve in the Prussian army, he obviously took up that obligation to serve in that militia. So that's the Revolutionary War piece of his service. And likewise, Maria Magdalena Daniel's family, there were a couple of very prominent Revolutionary War figures that came out of her family. But it's a pain to try to document all that stuff. The Sons of the American Revolution can do without me.